Good evening. Tonight we descend into the story of a white crystalline powder that began as Bayer's miracle cure, marketed in amber bottles alongside aspirin, and ended as the substance claiming over 100,000 American lives each year. A pharmaceutical triumph that became humanity's most devastating addiction. No hyperbole needed. The facts alone are staggering enough to silence any room. This journey spans 5,400 years of human civilization. From Sumerian priests calling it the joy plant, to medieval physicians wielding it as their most trusted remedy, to modern emergency rooms where it arrives cut with fentanyl and pressed into counterfeit pills. The same molecular structure, the same chemical embrace, the same ruin, echoing across millennia. This is the complete history, not sanitized for comfort, not simplified for easy consumption. We will trace the thread from Mesopotamian poppy fields, through Bayer's German laboratories, through 2 world wars, and the French Connection, through pharmaceutical lobbying and prescription pads written in good faith, to the morgues where bodies are tagged and families are shattered. Every transformation, every justification, every consequence documented. Before we continue with this exploration, if this type of content resonates with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. And in the comments, share where you are and what time it is where you're listening. Our community reaches across the globe, united in these dark hours of contemplation. Now, let us begin where all opiates begin, with a flower. The plant we know as Papaver somniferum appeared in human cultivation around 3,400 years before the Common Era in Lower Mesopotamia, that cradle of civilization where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved fertility from desert. The Sumerians, those first architects of writing and mathematics and urban life, grew it deliberately in their fields. They had a name for it, Hul Gil, the joy plant. Not a metaphor, not poetic license. Joy. They understood what it did. The opium poppy is unremarkable to the untrained eye, an annual herb reaching 2 to 4 feet in height, with lobed leaves of pale green and flowers that bloom in shades of white, pink, purple. But it is the seed pod that matters. 10 to 14 days after the petals fall, the pod swells to the size of a hen's egg, smooth and bulbous, filled with thousands of tiny seeds that will become the poppy seeds sprinkled on bagels and baked into pastries 5,000 years later. If you score the surface of that unripe pod with a blade, carefully, not too deep, a thick white latex oozes from the cuts. Opium. The Sumerians called this substance the white milk. They harvested it in the early morning when the latex flowed most freely, scraping the semi-dried resin from the scored pods with curved wooden spatulas, collecting it in clay vessels. Left to air dry in the Mesopotamian sun, this raw opium became a brown-black paste that could be stored, traded, prepared as medicine. And it was medicine. Make no mistake about that. The opium poppy contains more than 20 alkaloid compounds, but 3 matter most: morphine, codeine, and thebaine. Morphine accounts for roughly 10% of raw opium by weight, and it is morphine that delivers the profound analgesia, the obliteration of physical pain that made opium indispensable to ancient physicians. A gift from the earth that actually worked when almost nothing else did. The Sumerians passed their knowledge to the Assyrians, who cultivated opium in the regions that would become northern Iraq and Syria. The Assyrians called the juice arat-papal, possibly the linguistic root of papaver. They refined cultivation techniques, collected the latex with iron scoops, expanded production. They passed it to the Babylonians, who continued the tradition, and from Babylonia, the knowledge spread to Egypt. By 1300 years before the Common Era, the Egyptian capital of Thebes had become renowned for its opium poppy fields. Opium, Thebacum, Theban opium, a luxury product, a medicine of such value that it featured in international trade routes extending across the Mediterranean. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts ever discovered, dating to approximately 1500 BCE, contains detailed instructions for using opium, for inducing sleep, for quieting crying children, for rendering patients insensible to the agony of surgery performed without anesthetic beyond the poppy's chemical mercy. But even then, even in those ancient centuries, they knew opium's darker nature. Egyptian physicians restricted its use primarily to priests, magicians, and warriors, not because it was sacred, though that claim was made, but because they understood it enslaved. That repeated use created a need that transcended medicine, that the body adapted, required more, suffered terribly when supply was withdrawn. The earliest addiction crisis did not begin in American suburbs. It began in the ancient Near East, where temple records document the struggle to control a substance that relieved suffering and created it in equal measure. Archaeological evidence scattered across the Mediterranean tells the same story. Excavations on Cyprus have uncovered specialized surgical knives from 1100 BCE, precision instruments designed specifically for scoring opium pods. The island manufactured ceramic vessels shaped like poppy seed capsules, what one archaeologist called prehistoric commodity branding. And residue analysis confirms these vessels contained opium alkaloids. They were found in temples and tombs, suggesting ritual use, but also in domestic settings, suggesting something more quotidian: relief, escape, dependence. The Phoenicians and Minoans carried opium in their trade ships, spreading it westward to Greece, to Carthage, to the ports of Europe. By the time Hippocrates practiced medicine in the 5th century BCE, opium was well established in the Greek physician's pharmacopoeia. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, wrote extensively about opium's properties. He recommended drinking white poppy juice mixed with nettle seed for its narcotic and hypnotic effects, for treating internal diseases, for managing pain that would otherwise be unmanageable. A century later, Pedanius Dioscorides, the Roman physician and pharmacologist, whose encyclopedia De Materia Medica would influence Western medicine for 15 centuries, documented meticulous specifications for preparing opium, how to identify the correct species of poppy, the precise timing for scoring the pods, the methods for collecting and storing the latex. He categorized opium according to the humoral theory of the time as having a cold nature, making it a sedative agent, ideal for treating insomnia, restlessness, the fevered agitation of illness. But Dioscorides also warned. He understood that the doses required for medical effect approached the doses that caused death, that the margin between therapy and toxicity was narrow, that opium's greatest gift, the obliteration of consciousness, could become permanent if miscalculated. Greek and Roman physicians knew patients who never woke from their opium sleep. In ancient Persia, opium appears in Avestan, texts dating back 3,000 years, where it is called Kaokarina. Persian physicians used it as an anesthetic for surgery, a revolutionary application given that cutting into a conscious human body was otherwise an exercise in managed horror. They also recognized its use in executions, a fact that speaks to the dual nature cultures could never quite reconcile. The same substance that saved lives could reliably end them, control suffering, or control death, a choice physicians made case by case. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly the 9th through 12th centuries of the Common Era, saw Persian physicians expand medical knowledge dramatically, particularly in pharmacy and pharmacology. They inherited the Greek and Roman texts, translated them, built upon them, and they wrote about opium with increasing sophistication. They understood tolerance. They documented withdrawal syndromes. They described the progression from medical use to dependence to addiction. In the 16th century, during the Safavid dynasty in Iran, opium abuse had become widespread enough that prominent scholars began composing treatises on addiction. The most famous is Afyuniye, written by Imad al-Din Mahmud ibn Mas'ud Shirazi. It is the first known individual work devoted entirely to opium and addiction. Shirazi described the cultivation of the poppy, the properties of opium, the side effects, the toxicity. But more importantly, he documented strategies for reducing opium doses gradually, for substituting less harmful medications, for attempting to break the cycle of dependence, 1600 years after Hippocrates. And physicians were still grappling with the same problem. The knowledge spread east along the Silk Road, that network of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia, India, China. Opium traveled with merchants, with soldiers, with physicians and priests. By the 6th or 7th century CE, opium had reached China, where it would eventually play a role in that nation's near collapse, but not yet. Not for centuries. First came the gradual integration into Chinese medicine, the recognition of its properties, the careful documentation by physicians of effects and dosages. And then, much later, the realization that something had gone terribly wrong. By the 18th century, the British East India Company had recognized an opportunity. China had goods Europe desperately wanted: tea, silk, porcelain, luxury goods that commanded extraordinary prices in London and Paris and Amsterdam. But China had little interest in European products. The trade imbalance drained European silver into Chinese coffers, an economically unsustainable arrangement. Opium was the solution. In 1750, the British East India Company seized control of Bengal and Bihar, regions in India with established opium production. The company established a monopoly, forbidding Indian poppy growers from selling to anyone else. They ramped up cultivation, refined production methods, and began smuggling massive quantities of opium into China, where it was illegal, but demand was growing. The numbers tell the story. In 1729, approximately 200 chests of opium per year arrived in China from European sources. By 1800, that number had risen to 4,500 chests annually. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of opium. The math is staggering. 630,000 pounds of opium flooding into China each year by the turn of the 19th century. And the numbers kept climbing. Chinese emperors understood what was happening. Emperor Zheng banned opium smoking and domestic sales in 1729, permitting it only for medicine. 70 years later, Emperor Qing banned opium entirely in 1799. The laws changed nothing. British smugglers worked with Chinese criminal organizations, bribing officials, hiding shipments, moving product through coastal cities where enforcement was weakest or most corrupt. The profits were obscene. The British East India Company could purchase Indian opium cheaply, sell it in China for silver, then use that silver to purchase Chinese goods for export to Europe. a triangle of trade built on engineered addiction. By the 1830s, China faced an internal crisis of staggering proportions. Millions of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium. The drug had spread from coastal cities into the interior, from the wealthy to the poor, from adults to children. It consumed family wealth. It destroyed productivity. It turned a significant portion of the population into desperate addicts willing to trade anything, food, shelter, their children's future, for the next pipe. In 1839, Chinese officials in Canton seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium, more than 2.5 million pounds of the drug. They were attempting to enforce their own laws in their own country. The British response was war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. British gunboats and superior military technology devastated Chinese defenses. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842 after Chinese defeat, forced China to pay reparations, opened 5 ports to British trade, and ceded Hong Kong to Britain. The treaty made no mention of opium, but the implicit understanding was clear. The trade would continue. A second Opium War followed from 1856 to 1860, with similar results. More ports opened, more concessions extracted. The Chinese government, unable to stop the opium trade through military means, eventually legalized and taxed it, attempting to regulate what it could not eliminate. This is the context into which morphine emerged. This is the world where physicians and chemists began experimenting with opium's alkaloids, attempting to isolate the specific compounds responsible for its effects. Attempting, they claimed, to perfect the drug, to capture its benefits while eliminating its dangers. In 1803, a German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Wilhelm Serturner succeeded in isolating opium's primary active ingredient. He dissolved raw opium in acid, then neutralized it with ammonia, producing white crystals of stunning purity. He named the substance morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine was revolutionary, purified, standardized, 10 times more potent than raw opium by weight. Physicians could calculate exact doses. They could achieve consistent effects. And because it could be administered by the newly invented hypodermic syringe, morphine bypassed the digestive system entirely, delivering immediate relief directly into the bloodstream. The medical community hailed it as God's own medicine. Finally, they believed opium had been perfected. The dangerous variability of raw opium eliminated, the impurities removed. What remained was pure analgesia, reliable and safe. They were catastrophically wrong. When the American Civil War began in 1861, morphine was the Union and Confederate Medical Corps' most valuable tool. Battlefield injuries were horrific. Minié balls shattered bones. Artillery shells tore bodies apart. The standard treatment for limb wounds was amputation, performed in field hospitals by surgeons working as fast as possible, often without adequate anesthetic. Morphine made the unbearable merely excruciating. It kept wounded soldiers from dying of shock. It allowed them to endure recovery. Physicians prescribed it freely, generously. They believed they were being merciful, and they were in the moment. But by the war's end in 1865, an estimated 400,000 soldiers had returned home addicted to morphine. The medical community had a name for it: the soldier's disease, morphine addiction, a direct result of battlefield medicine and the belief that morphine, unlike opium, could be used safely. Meanwhile, in civilian life, morphine became ubiquitous. Pharmaceutical companies sold it by mail order. The Sears and Roebuck catalog offered a syringe and a small amount of morphine or cocaine for $1.50. Physicians prescribed morphine for headaches, menstrual cramps, coughs, insomnia, anxiety, grief. Patent medicines containing morphine were sold over the counter, marketed to women especially, since respectable women could not frequent saloons where men self-medicated with alcohol. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, sat in medicine cabinets across America and Britain. Mothers gave it to crying babies, sometimes with fatal results when the dose was miscalculated. The line between medicine and poison remained as narrow as it had been in ancient Egypt. But now, the poison was more potent, more concentrated, more accessible. By the late 19th century, the medical establishment was beginning to recognize a problem. Morphine addiction was widespread, devastating, and growing. Patients required higher and higher doses to achieve the same effect. Tolerance developed rapidly, withdrawal was agonizing, and once addicted, patients rarely recovered. Physicians needed a solution, a way to treat pain without creating addicts, a drug that provided morphine's benefits without its terrible cost. In 1874, an English chemist named C.R. Alder Wright, working at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in London, began experimenting with morphine derivatives. He boiled morphine with acetic anhydride for several hours, creating a new compound, diacetylmorphine. He tested it on dogs and rabbits. The results were disturbing: severe respiratory depression, convulsions, terror. Wright documented his findings and abandoned the research. His notes gathered dust for 23 years, and then, in 1897, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann, working at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Elberfeld, Germany, independently synthesized the same compound. He wasn't looking for it. His supervisor, Heinrich Draeser, had instructed him to acetylate morphine with the goal of producing codeine, another opium alkaloid with milder effects. Instead, Hoffmann created something far more powerful. When Bayer tested the new compound on employees, including Draeser himself, the subjects reported feeling heroish, heroic, strong, powerful. The head of Bayer's research department coined a brand name based on that German word, heroin. On August 21st, 1897, just 11 days after Hoffmann had synthesized aspirin, Bayer had its second, blockbuster drug, and this one, they believed, would change medicine forever. They had no idea how right they were. Bayer Pharmaceutical Company began commercial production of heroin in 1898. They manufactured it at scale in their Elberfeld facility, producing the white crystalline powder in quantities measured in tons. The hydrochloride salt form dissolved easily in water, making it ideal for injection or oral solution. They packaged it in distinctive amber glass bottles with colorful labels featuring the Bayer Cross logo. The marketing materials described heroin as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, a miracle cure for coughs, colds, bronchitis, tuberculosis, and pain of all kinds. The claims were not presented timidly. Bayer's promotional literature stated explicitly that heroin was safer than morphine, that it lacked morphine's addictive properties, that it represented a pharmaceutical breakthrough, the perfection of opium that physicians had sought for centuries. Medical journals published enthusiastic reports. Physicians prescribed it with confidence. Within months, heroin was available in pharmacies across Europe and the United States. A bottle of heroin cough syrup sat on the shelf next to aspirin and antiseptics, another byproduct for the modern age. Parents gave it to children with whooping cough. Physicians prescribed it for post-operative pain, for tuberculosis patients whose lungs were being consumed by bacterial infection, for anyone suffering respiratory distress. The dose was considered self-evident. Take as needed for symptom relief. Early clinical results seemed to confirm Bayer's promises. Patients reported dramatic relief from coughs that had persisted for months. Post-surgical pain diminished. Tuberculosis patients could sleep through the night without choking on blood and phlegm. Physicians published case studies documenting heroin's effectiveness. Some claimed it was 10 times more effective than morphine at treating respiratory diseases while producing a fraction of morphine's negative side effects. What they were observing, of course, was diacetylmorphine's superior pharmacokinetics. The two acetyl groups Hoffman had attached to the morphine molecule allowed heroin to cross the blood-brain barrier much faster than morphine alone. Once in the brain, enzymes cleaved those acetyl groups off, converting heroin back into morphine. But the initial rush, the rapid onset of effect, made heroin feel qualitatively different, stronger, cleaner, better. The patients felt heroic, just as Bayer's test subjects had reported. Pain vanished, anxiety dissolved, the cough reflex suppressed completely. And in those first doses, before tolerance developed, before physical dependence established itself, heroin did seem like a miracle, but some physicians were observing something troubling. Patients returned requesting more. The relief was temporary, they said. The cough was returning. The pain was coming back. Could they have a larger bottle, a stronger dose? And when physicians suggested switching to a different remedy, patients became agitated, insistent, desperate in ways that seemed disproportionate to a simple cough medicine. By the early 1900s, warnings began appearing in medical literature. Isolated reports at first. A physician in Boston noting that several of his patients taking heroin for chronic bronchitis now required the drug daily. A hospital in New York documenting withdrawal symptoms in surgical patients who had been given heroin for post-operative pain management. The symptoms were identical to morphine withdrawal: sweating, muscle aches, nausea, profound anxiety, insomnia, but they manifested faster, more intensely. In 1902, a physician named G.E. Petty published an article in the Alabama Medical Journal titled "The Heroin Habit, Another Curse." He described patients who had become enslaved to the drug after taking it exactly as prescribed. He documented the progression: initial relief, increasing doses, daily necessity, inability to function without it. He used the term heroinism to describe the condition, recognizing it as distinct from but related to morphine addiction. Other physicians published similar observations. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Heroin was not safer than morphine. It was more addictive. Tolerance developed more rapidly. Physical dependence established itself more completely. And withdrawal, when patients tried to stop, was more severe. But Bayer's marketing continued. Heroin was too profitable to abandon based on scattered medical reports. The company had invested heavily in production facilities, in distribution networks, in advertising campaigns. And importantly, the medical community remained divided. For every physician warning about heroin addiction, there were 5 others still prescribing it confidently, convinced that their patients were different, that addiction only occurred in those with weak constitutions or moral failings. In 1906, the American Medical Association officially approved heroin for general medical use. They recommended it as a replacement for morphine in most applications. This endorsement, coming from America's most prestigious medical organization, gave physicians permission to prescribe heroin even more liberally. By 1910, an estimated 200,000 people in New York City alone were addicted to heroin. The drug had escaped medical control entirely. It was being used recreationally, sought out not for coughs or pain, but for the euphoria it produced, the profound sense of well-being, of everything being fundamentally all right, that heroin delivered more reliably than any drug yet discovered. Users described it as wrapping yourself in warm cotton, floating above all worry and fear and pain. The physical world softened. Problems that had seemed insurmountable became distant and irrelevant. And then, hours later, they returned. The problems, the pain, the worry. But now accompanied by the beginning of withdrawal, a creeping discomfort that intensified if the next dose didn't arrive on schedule. The cycle had begun. Relief, then need, then relief again. The intervals between doses growing shorter, the doses themselves growing larger. This was not what Bayer had promised. This was not the perfection of opium. This was opium's darkest properties, concentrated and amplified. Morphine addiction had been devastating. Heroin addiction was worse. The descent was faster. The grip was tighter. And recovery, when attempted, was a prolonged agony that most patients could not endure. Heinrich Draeser, the Bayer supervisor who had overseen heroin's development and championed its commercial production, never publicly acknowledged the mistake. He had believed, genuinely it seems, that acetylating morphine would reduce its addictive potential. The logic was superficially reasonable: modify the molecule, change its properties, eliminate the problems. But human neurochemistry does not bend to commercial logic. The mu opioid receptors in the brain responded to heroin exactly as they responded to morphine, only faster and more intensely. By 1912, international concern about narcotics had reached a critical threshold. The United States convened the International Opium Convention at The Hague, the first international drug control treaty. 46 nations eventually signed, committing to control the production and distribution of opium, morphine, cocaine, and their derivatives. The treaty recognized that these substances, while medically valuable, posed a serious threat to public health and social stability. But international treaties move slowly, and enforcement was largely left to individual nations. In the United States, domestic pressure for drug regulation had been building for years. The patent medicine industry had come under scrutiny. Journalists had exposed the morphine, cocaine, and heroin content of over-the-counter remedies marketed to children. The progressive movement demanded government intervention to protect public health. In December 1914, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act into law. The act required anyone who produced, imported, manufactured, distributed, or dispensed opium, coca leaves, or their derivatives to register with the federal government and pay a special tax. It mandated detailed record keeping for all narcotics transactions. Possession of narcotics without a prescription was presumed to be illegal. On its face, the Harrison Act was a tax and regulation measure, not an outright prohibition. Physicians could still prescribe narcotics for legitimate medical purposes. Pharmacists could still dispense them with proper documentation. But the act contained a clause that would reshape American drug policy for the next century. Prescriptions had to be issued in the course of professional practice. Federal prosecutors and the Treasury Department's Narcotics Division interpreted that clause aggressively. They argued that prescribing narcotics to maintain an addict's habit was not legitimate medical practice. It was enabling addiction, which they defined as criminal behavior rather than a medical condition. Physicians who wrote prescriptions for addicted patients were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. The medical community received the message clearly. Do not treat addicts. Do not prescribe maintenance doses. Do not help these people manage their dependence. If patients were addicted to narcotics, that was now a legal problem, not a medical one. Some cities attempted to establish municipal narcotic clinics where addicted individuals could receive controlled doses of morphine or heroin to prevent withdrawal while attempting gradual reduction. 35 such clinics opened across the United States between 1918 and 1920. They varied widely in approach. Some aimed for indefinite maintenance, recognizing that some patients might never fully recover. Others focused on detoxification through gradual withdrawal. Some were efficiently run by dedicated physicians. Others were profit-driven enterprises of questionable medical value, but all shared the same fate. The Treasury Department viewed them as dangerous precedents that undermined the Harrison Act's intent. Federal agents shut them down, usually within a year of opening. The message was unambiguous. There would be no legal pathway for addicts to obtain narcotics, even under medical supervision. In March 1919, the Supreme Court issued 2 rulings that cemented this interpretation. In United States v. Doremus and Webb v. United States, the court upheld the constitutionality of the Harrison Act and ruled explicitly that physicians could not prescribe narcotics to addicts merely to maintain their comfort and prevent withdrawal. Prescription for maintenance purposes was not legitimate medical practice. The cases themselves are revealing. Dr. Doremus had prescribed large quantities of heroin to a man named Alexander Emeris, described in court documents as a person popularly known as a dope fiend. The language is instructive. Not a patient, not someone suffering from a medical condition, a dope fiend. The epithet transformed a health crisis into a moral failing, addiction into depravity. With the Supreme Court's blessing, enforcement intensified. Physicians were arrested for writing prescriptions to patients they had treated for years. Some were convicted and imprisoned. The medical profession learned quickly. Treating addiction was dangerous to one's career and freedom. Better to turn addicts away, to refuse to see them, to close the door on their suffering. And so addiction shifted from a medical problem to a criminal one. The patients who had become dependent on heroin through legitimate medical use, prescribed by physicians, dispensed by pharmacists, taken as directed, now had nowhere to turn. The pharmaceutical supply they had relied on vanished overnight. Withdrawal was excruciating, a full-body rebellion of nervous system and muscle and organ. Most could not endure it without medical support, and medical support was now illegal. A black market emerged to fill the void. Criminal organizations recognized the opportunity. Demand existed, enormous and desperate demand, and legal supply had been eliminated. The economics were irresistible. Heroin could be manufactured in clandestine laboratories, smuggled across borders, distributed through criminal networks. The profit margins were extraordinary. In 1924, Congress went further. The Heroin Act banned the drug entirely, even for medical use. Manufacturing, importing, and possessing heroin became illegal under all circumstances. The United States joined a small number of countries that prohibited heroin completely, arguing that its medical benefits did not justify its dangers. Bayer had lost the trademark rights to the name heroin 5 years earlier under the Treaty of Versailles, one of the penalties imposed on Germany after World War I. The company no longer profited from the drug it had unleashed on the world. But the drug itself did not disappear. It simply moved from amber bottles in pharmacies to glassine bags in alleys. Between 1914 and 1924, heroin had transformed from a miracle cure to a forbidden substance. The shift happened with remarkable speed, a mere decade from endorsement by the American Medical Association to total prohibition. But the transformation solved nothing. The 200,000 New Yorkers addicted to heroin in 1910 did not cease to be addicted when the laws changed. They simply became criminals. Prohibition created a clandestine industry that would endure for the next century. The market for heroin did not collapse when legal production stopped. It expanded. Because demand, the desperate chemical need that heroin created in those who used it, could not be legislated away. The cycle that had begun with Sumerian poppy farmers and continued through British opium traders and Bayer's laboratories now entered a new phase. The underground years were beginning, and they would be darker than anything that had come before. The pattern was already established, though few recognized it yet. Make opiates legal and medical, and addiction spreads through prescriptions and over-the-counter sales. Make them illegal, and addiction spreads through criminal networks and contaminated supply. The poppy itself remains indifferent to laws, to treaties, to moral condemnation. It grows where conditions allow, produces its alkaloids according to biochemistry, and waits for humans to extract them. Heroin in 1924 existed in the same form it had in 1897 when Hoffman first synthesized it. Diacetyl morphine, two acetyl groups attached to a morphine molecule. The chemistry had not changed. The neuropharmacology had not changed. What had changed was context, legality, the systems humans built around the drug. But the drug itself and what it did to human brains remained constant, and that constancy would prove more powerful than any law. When legitimate pharmaceutical production of heroin ceased in the United States in 1924, the drug did not vanish. It relocated. Manufacturing shifted from regulated factories with quality control and standardized dosing to clandestine laboratories operating beyond the reach of any government oversight. The heroin that reached American streets in the years that followed bore little resemblance to the pharmaceutical-grade diacetyl morphine that Bayer had once bottled in amber glass. China became the first major source of illicitly manufactured heroin. The country was already drowning in opium addiction, a crisis engineered by British colonial policy and perpetuated by Chinese criminal organizations who had taken over distribution after the Opium Wars. When European and Japanese pharmaceutical companies began exporting morphine and heroin to China in the 1920s, they found an eager market. Former opium smokers discovered that injectable morphine and heroin delivered a more intense effect more rapidly than smoking opium. The transition was swift and devastating. Japanese pharmaceutical firms recognized the profit potential. They manufactured heroin in vast quantities specifically for the Chinese market, shipping it through coastal cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong. The drugs arrived as white powders of reasonable purity, pharmaceutical preparations that happened to be destined for illegal use rather than medical applications. Chinese organized crime syndicates controlled distribution, and the drugs spread from the coastal cities into the interior. But international pressure was mounting. The League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, began coordinating efforts to restrict narcotics trafficking. Treaties were signed, production quotas were established. Legitimate pharmaceutical companies came under increasing scrutiny. By the early 1930s, legal production and international shipment of heroin had decreased significantly. The demand, however, had not decreased. If anything, it had intensified. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens were now dependent on heroin. Their need was not a choice they could simply abandon because treaties had been signed or because governments had decided the drug should no longer exist. Chemical dependence operates according to neurobiology, not policy. Clandestine laboratories filled the gap. They appeared in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in the rural countryside where enforcement was impossible. These were not sophisticated pharmaceutical facilities. They were improvised operations, often called kitchen laboratories or jungle laboratories, depending on their location. The manufacturing process was crude but effective. Raw opium or morphine base served as starting material. Acetic anhydride, the same chemical Hoffman had used at Bayer, converted morphine into heroin through a simple heating process. The purity varied wildly. Some labs produced heroin that approached pharmaceutical quality. Others created a contaminated mixture of diacetylmorphine, unreacted morphine, chemical impurities, and whatever cutting agents the manufacturers chose to add. Every person in the distribution chain diluted the product further. Smugglers cut it to reduce volume and increase profit. Traffickers cut it again. Street dealers cut it a third or fourth time. By the time heroin reached the actual user, its purity might be 10%, 5%, sometimes less. This created a lethal unpredictability. Users had no way to know what they were injecting. One bag might contain heroin so diluted it barely prevented withdrawal. The next might be relatively pure and cause an immediate overdose. The variation killed people regularly, but that fact did not reduce demand. It simply made addiction more dangerous. The desperate daily mathematics of dosing a gamble with death. World War II temporarily disrupted the heroin supply chains. International shipping became difficult. Borders closed. Enforcement focused on war effort rather than drug trafficking. The number of addicts in the United States declined somewhat during the war years, not because of effective treatment, but because supply became scarce. Enough that some users were forced into withdrawal, whether they wanted it or not. But when the war ended, trafficking resumed with renewed vigor, and a new route had emerged that would dominate the heroin trade for the next 3 decades. Marseille, France, became the refining capital of the world. The city's port had long been a hub for Mediterranean shipping, and French Corsican crime syndicates controlled significant portions of the waterfront. These organizations established a sophisticated system. Raw opium or morphine base arrived from Turkey and other Middle Eastern sources. Laboratories hidden in legitimate businesses, factories, warehouses, even apartments, refined the morphine into heroin of exceptional purity, often 80 to 90% pure. This was the French Connection, a term that would later be immortalized in film, but which described a very real pipeline that flooded the United States with heroin from the 1930s through the early 1970s. The Corsican syndicates had connections throughout Europe and established smuggling routes that proved remarkably resistant to law enforcement interdiction. The heroin was concealed in cargo shipments, in automobiles, in the personal luggage of couriers who traveled between France and the United States. It arrived in New York, the primary destination, where Italian-American organized crime families controlled distribution into the city and outward to other markets. The profits were staggering. Heroin purchased in Marseille for a few $1,000s could be cut and sold on American streets for hundreds of thousands. The French Connection heroin was notably pure compared to what had come before. Users could inject smaller quantities and achieve the desired effect. But purity is a double-edged attribute. When heroin is cut extensively and users adapt to that diluted product, a sudden introduction of purer heroin causes overdoses. The body has developed tolerance based on the diluted product. Pure heroin overwhelms that tolerance. Still, the French Connection represented a kind of stability in the heroin market. The supply was relatively consistent. The purity, while variable, stayed within a certain range. Criminal organizations had an incentive to keep customers alive and purchasing. Dead addicts generate no revenue. This grim calculus created a baseline, a floor, beneath which quality rarely fell. During these decades, heroin embedded itself into American culture in ways that transcended simple addiction statistics. The drug became associated with artistic circles, particularly jazz musicians in the 1940s and 50s. A staggering number of the era's most talented artists used heroin. Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, Chet Baker, Art Pepper, Miles Davis for a time. The list is long and tragic. The mythology around heroin and jazz suggested that the drug enhanced creativity, that it provided access to musical insight unavailable to sober minds. This was romantic delusion. What heroin provided was escape from the racism, poverty, and brutality that black musicians especially faced in mid-century America. It offered temporary relief from a world that celebrated their art while denying them basic human dignity. But the cost was extraordinary. Charlie Parker died at 34, his body so ravaged by heroin and alcohol that the coroner estimated his age at 53. Billie Holiday died at 44, arrested on her deathbed for drug possession, handcuffed to the hospital bed as she succumbed to liver and heart failure. Chet Baker's teeth fell out from abscesses caused by dirty needles, ending his trumpet career and forcing him to relearn music as a vocalist. The heroin did not enhance their genius. It consumed it, yet the association persisted. Heroin carried a bohemian mystique, a suggestion of dangerous sophistication. This cultural mythology helped the drug spread beyond jazz circles into broader populations. By the 1960s, heroin was prevalent in urban centers across America, particularly in neighborhoods where poverty and segregation created conditions of concentrated despair. The drug offered what nothing else could: complete emotional anesthesia. For people living in communities destroyed by racist housing policy, by economic disinvestment, by violent policing, by the systematic destruction of family structures, heroin provided hours of relief from intolerable reality. The trap, of course, was that each use made the next use more necessary. The brief escape became a permanent cage. And then American foreign policy created a new source that would eclipse even the French Connection. In the 1960s, the United States became deeply involved in Southeast Asia, fighting a war in Vietnam that would eventually claim more than 58,000 American lives and immeasurably more Vietnamese casualties. The war also intersected with one of the world's most productive opium-growing regions, the Golden Triangle, where Burma, Thailand, and Laos meet. This region had cultivated opium poppies for centuries, but production accelerated dramatically during the Cold War. Various armed groups, nationalist Chinese forces who had fled to Burma after the Communist Revolution, regional warlords, insurgent armies, financed their operations through opium production and trafficking. And the Central Intelligence Agency, focused on combating communist influence in the region, developed relationships with some of these groups. The details remain partially obscured by classification and official denial, but the evidence is substantial. CIA-aligned forces controlled opium production. Air America, the CIA's airline, transported cargo that included opium and heroin. American money and weapons flowed to warlords whose primary income derived from drug trafficking. The rationalization was geopolitical. These groups fought communists, therefore their drug trafficking was an acceptable cost of containing Soviet and Chinese influence. The human cost accrued elsewhere. American soldiers in Vietnam encountered cheap, exceptionally pure heroin. Combat is traumatic. Watching friends die, killing other human beings, living in constant fear, these experiences damage the psyche in ways that leave lasting scars. Heroin offered oblivion, temporary erasure of memory and fear and guilt. Soldiers began using it, first occasionally, then regularly, then compulsively. Estimates vary, but credible studies suggest that 15 to 20% of American soldiers in Vietnam used heroin during their deployment. Most smoked it rather than injecting it, which carried a lower risk of overdose and disease transmission, but still established physical dependence. When these soldiers returned home, many brought their addiction with them. The stereotype of the Vietnam veteran junkie became embedded in American culture. Another layer of stigma heaped onto men who had been drafted into a war they didn't want to fight and returned to a country that despised them for it. Some recovered, many did not. The Veterans Administration was ill-equipped to treat addiction at scale, and the broader medical system still operated under the principle that maintaining addicts on opioids was illegal. Meanwhile, Southeast Asian heroin began flooding the American market, joining the European supply from the French connection. Mexican production also increased during this period. Mexican traffickers cultivated opium poppies in remote mountain regions and produced black tar heroin, a crude form of the drug that was dark brown or black and had a sticky, tar-like consistency. It was less pure than French connection heroin, containing more impurities and plant matter, but it was cheaper and increasingly available, particularly in Western states. By the early 1970s, the United States faced a heroin crisis of unprecedented scale. The drug was available in every major city. Addiction rates had soared. Overdose deaths were climbing. Property crime, driven by addicts desperate to fund their habits, was epidemic. And the criminal justice system, the primary governmental response, was overwhelmed. In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one and announced a war on drugs. The rhetoric was martial. The approach was primarily punitive. Billions of dollars flowed into law enforcement, border interdiction, and incarceration. The Drug Enforcement Administration was created in 1973, consolidating various federal drug enforcement agencies into a single organization with expanded powers and budget. The war would continue for decades, expanding through subsequent administrations regardless of political party. It would incarcerate millions of Americans, disproportionately black and brown citizens, despite similar usage rates across racial groups. It would destabilize Latin American countries. It would fill prisons to capacity and beyond. And it would fail comprehensively and repeatedly to significantly reduce drug availability or addiction rates, because enforcement focused on supply reduction while demand remained constant. Arrest one dealer, another appears. Shut down one trafficking route, 3 more develop. Destroy one laboratory, 10 more are constructed. The economics are too compelling. As long as millions of people desperately need heroin to function, to avoid withdrawal, to survive another day, someone will supply it. The profit margins guarantee it. The French connection was eventually disrupted in the early 1970s through coordinated law enforcement operations between American and French authorities. Major laboratories were raided. Key figures were arrested. The Marseille pipeline diminished significantly, but heroin did not become scarce. Southeast Asian suppliers expanded. Mexican production increased. Turkish traffickers established new routes. The market adapted. It always adapts. Because markets respond to demand, and demand for heroin among dependent users is not optional. It is a biological imperative created by chronic opioid exposure. The underground years established patterns that would persist through the end of the century. Heroin as a criminal enterprise rather than a pharmaceutical product. Purity as a dangerous variable. Addiction as a crime rather than a medical condition. And law enforcement as the primary response, despite its demonstrated ineffectiveness at reducing either supply or demand. The poppy fields continued to bloom in the Golden Triangle, in Mexico, in Afghanistan, where production would eventually surpass all other regions. The refineries continued to operate, hidden in urban buildings and rural compounds. The smuggling routes continued to deliver product across borders that enforcement could monitor but never fully seal. And in American cities, in apartments and alleyways and abandoned buildings, people continued to inject heroin into their veins. Some would survive for years, decades even, managing their addiction through sheer stubbornness and luck. Others would die, their bodies found in positions that suggested they had been reaching for something, anything, at the moment consciousness fled. The pattern had been established 5,000 years earlier in Sumerian fields. It had intensified through morphine and accelerated through heroin. And it was about to transform again in ways that would make everything that had come before seem almost manageable by comparison. The pharmaceutical industry had learned nothing from Bayer's heroin disaster. Or perhaps they had learned precisely the wrong lesson, that opioids were extraordinarily profitable until the consequences became impossible to ignore, and even then, the profits often exceeded the penalties. In the 1980s and 90s, the American medical establishment underwent a fundamental shift in how it approached pain management. For decades, physicians had been conservative with opioid prescriptions, wary of creating addicts, mindful of morphine and heroin's documented capacity to enslave. Opioids were reserved for acute pain following surgery or injury, and for terminal cancer patients whose remaining time measured in weeks or months. But a coalition of pain management specialists, pharmaceutical companies, and patient advocacy groups began arguing that this conservatism was cruel, that millions of Americans suffered from chronic pain that deserved treatment, that newer opioid formulations were safer than older ones, that concerns about addiction had been exaggerated, that undertreated pain was itself a medical crisis demanding aggressive intervention. The campaign succeeded. Medical societies endorsed new pain management guidelines. Pain was designated the fifth vital sign to be assessed at every medical encounter alongside temperature, pulse, respiration, and blood pressure. Physicians were encouraged to treat pain aggressively. Medical journals published articles asserting that addiction risk from prescription opioids was less than 1% when the drugs were used appropriately for pain. This statistic was false. The studies cited were misrepresented, their methodologies flawed, their conclusions overstated. But the medical community, genuinely desiring to help patients in pain, largely accepted the claims at face value. And the pharmaceutical industry stood ready to supply the solution. In 1996, Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin, a controlled-release formulation of oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid derived from the bane, one of the alkaloids present in opium. The controlled-release mechanism was supposed to deliver steady pain relief for 12 hours, eliminating the need for frequent dosing. Purdue marketed OxyContin as a breakthrough in pain management, safer and less prone to abuse than immediate-release opioids. The marketing was aggressive and sophisticated. Purdue sales representatives visited physicians' offices armed with studies, charts, literature emphasizing OxyContin's benefits and minimizing its risks. They sponsored conferences where pain specialists taught other physicians about the importance of treating pain. They provided free samples, they offered incentives, and they consistently claimed that OxyContin's controlled-release formulation made it resistant to abuse and less addictive than other opioids. These claims were lies. Purdue knew they were lies. Internal documents later revealed that company executives were aware OxyContin could be easily abused by crushing the tablets to defeat the controlled-release mechanism, allowing users to inject or snort the entire 12-hour dose at once. They knew the addiction risk was substantial. They knew the 12-hour duration often failed to last 12 hours, leaving patients in withdrawal before the next scheduled dose. But the lies were profitable, extraordinarily, obscenely profitable. By 2001, OxyContin was generating over $1 billion in annual revenue for Purdue. Doctors prescribed it for back pain, arthritis, post-surgical recovery, injuries. Patients took it as directed, trusting their physicians, trusting the pharmaceutical company, trusting that the medical system would not harm them. And then they discovered they could not stop. The progression was predictable, even mechanical. A patient injured at work receives a prescription for OxyContin. 60 tablets, take one every 12 hours, as needed for pain. The pain diminishes. The prescription refills. The patient takes the medication for weeks, then months. The pain improves, but never quite disappears. The doctor renews the prescription. The patient's body adapts to the presence of oxycodone, developing tolerance, requiring higher doses to achieve the same relief. When the patient tries to stop, withdrawal begins within hours. Muscle aches, sweating, nausea, anxiety that builds into panic, insomnia, restlessness, the sensation of skin crawling, and pain, not just the original pain, but a new pain, a total body suffering that feels like every nerve is exposed and screaming. The patient calls the doctor. The doctor prescribes more OxyContin. The cycle continues. This is not moral failure. This is pharmacology. This is what opioids do to human neurobiology when taken regularly for extended periods. The brain's endogenous opioid system shuts down in response to external opioid supply. The receptor systems recalibrate. Dependence becomes a physical fact. Between 1999 and 2010, the rate of opioid prescribing in the United States quadrupled. Doctors wrote prescriptions for chronic back pain, for fibromyalgia, for headaches, for conditions that previous generations of physicians would never have treated with long-term opioids. The pills accumulated in medicine cabinets. Teenagers found them and experimented. Construction workers took them to get through the workday. Elderly patients stockpiled them. And a substantial percentage of the people prescribed these medications became addicted. The numbers are staggering. Between 1999 and 2010, opioid-involved overdose deaths in the United States doubled, from 2.9 deaths per 100,000 people to 6.8. This was the first wave of the modern opioid crisis. Prescription painkillers, legal medications, drugs approved by the Food and Drug Administration, prescribed by licensed physicians, dispensed by registered pharmacists. Pill mills proliferated, particularly in Florida and Appalachian states. These were pain management clinics that existed solely to prescribe opioids. Patients would drive hundreds of miles, wait in parking lots with dozens of others, pay cash for a brief consultation with a physician who asked no questions and prescribed whatever quantity the patient requested. The pills would then be sold on the street or used personally until the next appointment. Law enforcement eventually shut down most pill mills, but the damage had been done. Millions of Americans were now dependent on prescription opioids. Their bodies required the drugs to function normally, to avoid withdrawal, to survive each day. And many had progressed beyond medical use to addiction, to compulsive use despite devastating consequences, to the complete reorganization of life around obtaining and using opioids. In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin. They admitted to misleading doctors, patients, and regulators about the drug's abuse potential. The company paid $635 million in fines and penalties. This sounds substantial until compared to the profits. OxyContin had generated tens of billions in revenue. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue, had extracted billions in personal wealth. $635 million was a rounding error, a cost of doing business. And crucially, Purdue continued to market OxyContin. The drug remained on the market. Prescribing continued. The medical community began to recognize the magnitude of the problem around this same time. Studies demonstrated that the addiction risk from prescription opioids was not less than 1%. It was substantial, perhaps 15 to 25% for long-term use. The pharmaceutical industry's claims had been fabricated or distorted. Pain management specialists who had championed aggressive opioid prescribing confronted evidence that their recommendations had created an epidemic. Professional medical societies revised their guidelines. The Centers for Disease Control issued new recommendations discouraging opioid prescriptions for chronic pain. State medical boards implemented prescription monitoring programs to track who was prescribing opioids and in what quantities. Physicians became more cautious, more reluctant to prescribe. And then, around 2010, something predictable happened. Patients who had been taking prescription opioids for months or years were suddenly cut off. Their prescriptions were not renewed. Their doctors, now fearful of regulatory scrutiny, refused to see them. The pill mills were shut down. The supply they had relied on vanished, but their physical dependence remained. The chemical need did not disappear because prescriptions stopped. Withdrawal remained as excruciating as ever, and on the street, an alternative was readily available: heroin. A single OxyContin pill on the black market cost $60 to $80 by 2010. That same $60 to $80 could purchase enough heroin for multiple doses. The economic calculation was simple. For someone in withdrawal, for someone whose body required opioids to function, heroin was the rational choice. The transition was documented in real time. Emergency departments saw an influx of patients who had started with prescription painkillers and moved to heroin. Treatment centers reported that the majority of new heroin users had begun with prescription opioids. Surveys found that 4 out of 5 new heroin users had first misused prescription painkillers. This was the second wave. Around 2010, heroin overdose deaths began to climb steeply. The rate increased from 1 death per 100,000 in 2010 to 4.9 per 100,000 by 2016. 28 states documented dramatic increases between 2010 and 2012. By 2015, heroin had surpassed prescription opioids as the leading opioid involved in overdose deaths. The heroin arriving on American streets came primarily from Mexico, where production had expanded massively to meet the new demand created by prescription opioid crackdown. Mexican cartels had refined their production methods, increasing both quantity and purity. The heroin was cheaper than it had been in decades and often more potent, but purity varied wildly, as it always had with illicit heroin. A user might purchase a bag that was 5% heroin by weight, develop a tolerance based on that diluted product, and then unknowingly purchase a bag that was 40% pure. The higher concentration would overwhelm their tolerance. Respiratory depression would follow. Breathing would slow, then stop. Death would occur within minutes. Even as heroin deaths climbed, an even more dangerous development was emerging: illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Fentanyl itself was not new. It had been synthesized in 1960 by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen, intended as a surgical anesthetic. Pharmaceutical fentanyl is extraordinarily potent, roughly 50 to 1, 100 times stronger than morphine, effective in microgram doses rather than milligram doses. It is used in hospitals for pain management and anesthesia, carefully dosed and monitored. But starting around 2013, clandestine laboratories began manufacturing fentanyl outside medical channels. The synthesis is relatively straightforward for someone with chemistry training and access to precursor chemicals. And the economics are compelling. A kilogram of fentanyl can be cut to produce the equivalent effect of 50 kilograms of heroin. Shipping costs decrease proportionally. A package containing a lethal supply of fentanyl for thousands of people can fit in an envelope. Drug traffickers began adding fentanyl to heroin, either to increase potency or simply to increase volume and profit. The mixture was often done haphazardly, without proper distribution of the fentanyl throughout the heroin. A user might inject what appeared to be normal heroin and receive a lethal dose of fentanyl concentrated in that particular portion of the mixture. Fentanyl was also pressed into counterfeit pills designed to look like prescription medications. OxyContin, Xanax, Vicodin, pills that users believed were pharmaceutical products, turned out to contain fentanyl in unknown and often fatal quantities. People who thought they were taking a prescription painkiller were actually ingesting a substance so potent that 2 milligrams, an amount smaller, then a few grains of salt could cause death. The third wave had begun. Starting around 2013, synthetic opioid deaths, primarily from illicitly manufactured fentanyl, increased exponentially. By 2016, fentanyl had surpassed both heroin and prescription opioids as the leading cause of opioid overdose deaths. The rate climbed from approximately 1 death per 100,000 in 2013 to over 21 deaths per 100,000 by 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened everything. Lockdowns isolated people, stress and anxiety intensified, access to treatment decreased, economic hardship increased. People used drugs alone, without anyone present to administer naloxone if they overdosed. The already rising death toll accelerated dramatically. In 2021 and 2022, the United States recorded over 100,000 drug overdose deaths annually for the first time in history. Over 107,000 in 2022. The majority involved fentanyl, not heroin, not prescription painkillers. Fentanyl. Additional synthetic opioids began appearing. Carfentanil, used as an elephant tranquilizer, is approximately 10,000 times more potent than morphine. Tiny amounts cause immediate overdose. Other fentanyl analogues, compounds with slightly modified chemical structures that produce similar effects, flooded the market. Each new variant represented manufacturers staying ahead of law enforcement, modifying the molecule just enough to evade existing regulations while maintaining or increasing potency. And then, Sulfasalazine entered the supply, a veterinary sedative used for horses. Xylazine is not an opioid and does not respond to naloxone. When mixed with fentanyl, which became increasingly common, it complicated overdose reversal. Naloxone could reverse the fentanyl's effects, but not the xylazine's. Users would be revived from respiratory depression only to remain heavily sedated at continued risk. Xylazine also causes severe tissue damage at injection sites, leading to necrotic wounds that extend far beyond the injection point. Users developed horrific ulcerations, blackened flesh that required surgical debridement or amputation. The drug was being mixed into the fentanyl supply without users' knowledge, adding yet another layer of harm. The pharmaceutical industry's pursuit of profit had created this cascade. The aggressive marketing of OxyContin and similar drugs had generated millions of new opioid users. The subsequent restriction of prescriptions had pushed those users toward heroin, and the heroin market, always seeking maximum profit and minimum shipping cost, had pivoted to fentanyl and its analogues. From Bayer's heroin in 1898 to Purdue's OxyContin in 1996, the pattern repeated. Promise safety, market aggressively, generate massive profits, deny problems until denial becomes impossible, pay fines that represent a fraction of revenue, and leave the human cost to be tallied by coroners and buried by devastated families. The machinery of pharmaceutical capitalism had produced exactly what it was designed to produce: profit. The suffering was not a failure of the system, it was a feature. Between 1999 and 2023, approximately 806,000 people in the United States died from opioid overdoses. Read that number again. 806,000. More than all American combat deaths in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. More than the entire population of several American cities. A death toll that represents not just individuals, but entire networks of family and friendship, communities hollowed out, generations scarred. In 2023 alone, over 105,000 people died from drug overdoses in the United States. The majority involved opioids. The majority of opioid deaths involved fentanyl. 90% of current opioid overdose deaths are attributable to synthetic opioids, primarily illicitly manufactured fentanyl and its analogs. Not heroin in the traditional sense. Not prescription painkillers. Fentanyl. The demographics tell a story of comprehensive devastation. Opioid overdose is now the leading cause of injury death in the United States. For Americans between the ages of 18 and 45, overdose kills more people than car accidents, more than gun violence, more than any disease. This is a catastrophe concentrated in the prime of life, destroying people in their productive years, leaving children without parents, parents without children. No demographic has been spared. White communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities, Native American reservations, all have been ravaged. The crisis began predominantly affecting white rural and suburban populations, a fact that finally generated significant media attention and political response after decades of ignoring urban crack, cocaine epidemics that destroyed Black neighborhoods. But by the time policy shifted toward treating addiction as a health crisis rather than purely a criminal matter, fentanyl had already made the problem exponentially worse and spread it everywhere. Rural communities face particular challenges. Treatment facilities are scarce. Distances are vast. The same economic despair that made OxyContin attractive, the collapse of manufacturing, the destruction of coal mining, the consolidation of agriculture persists. In counties across Appalachia, the Rust Belt, the rural Midwest, overdose deaths occur at rates that would trigger emergency federal intervention if they resulted from any other cause. Urban centers are overwhelmed. Emergency departments see multiple overdoses nightly. Paramedics carry naloxone as standard equipment, administering it routinely, sometimes reviving the same individuals multiple times in a single week. The naloxone, marketed as Narcan, works by displacing opioids from receptors in the brain, temporarily reversing respiratory depression. It saves lives, but it is not a solution. It is a brief reprieve that allows the overdosing person to breathe long enough to potentially seek treatment they often cannot access. The mechanics of a fentanyl overdose are clinically straightforward. Opioids bind to mu-opioid receptors throughout the central nervous system, particularly in the brainstem regions that control breathing. At therapeutic doses, this produces analgesia and mild respiratory depression. At higher doses, breathing slows dangerously. At toxic doses, it stops entirely. The body starves for oxygen. Brain tissue begins dying within minutes. The heart continues beating for a time, pumping deoxygenated blood until cardiac arrest follows respiratory arrest. If naloxone is administered quickly, if someone is present to recognize the overdose and respond, the opioid can be displaced from the receptors and breathing can resume. If not, death occurs within 10 to 15 minutes. Most people die alone, in bathrooms, in bedrooms, in parked cars, in public restrooms, in tents under highway overpasses. They inject or snort what they believe is heroin, or what they know is fentanyl, seeking relief from withdrawal or from psychological pain or from the unbearable monotony of hopeless existence. The drug takes effect. Euphoria, perhaps, for 30 seconds. Then unconsciousness, then respiratory depression, then death. By the time they are discovered, hours later, the next morning, days later, the opportunity for intervention has long passed. Naloxone requires someone to administer it. It requires recognition that an overdose is occurring. Most people use alone because addiction is stigmatized, because sharing drugs is risky, because isolation is a feature of the disease. That isolation kills them. The governmental response has been fragmented, underfunded, and largely ineffective. In October 2017, the Trump administration declared the opioid crisis a national public health emergency under the Public Health Service Act. This declaration has been renewed every 90 days since then, through the Biden administration and into the present. The emergency status remains continuous because the emergency remains continuous. Federal funding has increased for treatment, for harm reduction, for prevention. Billions of dollars have been allocated. States have expanded access to medication-assisted treatment using methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone to manage opioid use disorder. These medications work by occupying opioid receptors without producing euphoria, reducing cravings, and preventing withdrawal, while allowing individuals to stabilize their lives. But access remains insufficient. Treatment facilities have waiting lists that extend for weeks or months. Insurance companies deny coverage. Regulations limit which physicians can prescribe buprenorphine and in what quantities. Many communities, particularly rural ones, have no treatment options at all. The gap between need and available services remains vast. Harm reduction programs have expanded, distributing clean needles, fentanyl test strips, and naloxone. Supervised consumption sites, where people can use drugs under medical supervision with immediate intervention available if overdose occurs, have been proposed and in a few locations implemented, despite federal ambiguity about their legal status. These programs save lives demonstrably, but they face fierce political opposition from those who view any accommodation of drug use as enabling addiction rather than acknowledging reality. The criminal justice system continues to incarcerate people for drug possession, though some jurisdictions have shifted toward diversion programs that mandate treatment rather than imprisonment. But incarceration itself often worsens outcomes. People detoxify in jail, losing their tolerance. When released, they return to using the same doses they took before incarceration, not recognizing that their lowered tolerance makes those doses lethal. Overdose death rates among recently released inmates are extraordinarily high. The civil lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies have produced settlements measured in billions. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy, and the Sackler family agreed to pay $6 billion over time to settle claims related to OxyContin. State and local governments sued CVS and Walgreens, which paid a combined $10.7 billion for their roles in filling opioid prescriptions despite red flags indicating diversion and abuse. These settlements sound substantial until considered against the scale of harm. $6 billion cannot resurrect 800,000 dead. It cannot repair the millions of lives destroyed by addiction. It cannot restore childhoods spent with addicted parents or erase the trauma of finding a loved one dead. The money funds treatment and prevention programs, which is valuable, but it does not constitute justice. The executives who made decisions that killed hundreds of thousands faced minimal personal consequences. The Sacklers remained billionaires. No one went to prison. Meanwhile, the border remains a flashpoint. Fentanyl is manufactured primarily in Mexico using precursor chemicals from China. The drugs are smuggled into the United States through ports of entry, hidden in vehicles, in cargo, in the personal belongings of travelers. Some comes through mail and express shipping, small packages containing enough fentanyl to kill thousands. Law enforcement seizes record quantities every year, tons of fentanyl, millions of counterfeit pills. The seizures make headlines. Politicians tout them as victories. But seizures represent only a fraction of supply. For every shipment intercepted, multiple others cross successfully. The demand is too great, the profit margins too high, the supply chains too flexible. Enforcement cannot seal a border thousands of miles long against a product that is compact, valuable, and desperately needed by millions of dependent users. China has taken steps to reduce precursor chemical exports, implementing stricter regulations on the compounds used to synthesize fentanyl. Production has adapted, shifting to different precursors, to different synthetic routes, to manufacturing in third countries. The chemistry is not complicated. The knowledge is widely available. Clandestine chemists stay ahead of regulations by modifying molecules slightly, creating new analogues faster than governments can schedule them as controlled substances. The human stories behind the statistics follow predictable patterns, variations on a theme of initial innocence destroyed by systemic failure. The college athlete prescribed OxyContin for a torn ACL. The construction worker injured on a job site. The young mother prescribed Vicodin after a cesarean section. The veteran prescribed painkillers for chronic back pain and PTSD. Each begins with legitimate medical need. Each receives legal prescriptions from licensed physicians. Each takes the medication as directed, trusting the medical system. And each discovers weeks or months later that stopping produces withdrawal so severe that continuing seems like the only option. Prescriptions refill, tolerance develops, doses increase, then the prescription ends. The doctor, now wary of regulatory scrutiny, refuses to renew it. The patient attempts to stop. Withdrawal is unbearable. They seek alternatives. A friend mentions they can get pills on the street. The patient, desperate, agrees. The pills cost $60 each. The patient cannot afford that for long. Someone suggests heroin. It is cheaper, they say. It works the same way. The patient resists initially. Heroin is for addicts, for people who made bad choices, not for someone who just needed pain relief after an injury. But withdrawal does not respect these distinctions. Eventually, economic necessity and physical suffering overcome stigma. The first time using heroin is terrifying and shameful. The second time is slightly less so. By the 10th time, it has become routine. The patient is now a user. The user becomes dependent. The dependence becomes the organizing principle of existence. Everything else, job, family, friends, hobbies, dignity, becomes secondary to the imperative of avoiding withdrawal. The physical deterioration is systematic. Veins collapse from repeated injections. Abscesses form at injection sites, pockets of infected tissue that require surgical drainage or antibiotics. Hepatitis C transmits through shed needles, slowly destroying the liver. HIV remains a risk despite needle exchange programs. Endocarditis, infection of the heart valves, occurs when bacteria enter the bloodstream through contaminated injections. Lung infections, kidney failure, overdose brain damage from previous episodes of oxygen deprivation. The psychological toll is equally devastating. Shame corrodes the sense of self. Secrecy isolates. The constant hustle to obtain drugs, the theft, the lies, the manipulation of loved ones, the sex work, the dealing, creates moral injury that compounds over time. Users are aware of what they have become, aware of the distance between who they were and who they are, and this awareness is its own torture. Some enter treatment, residential programs if they can access them, outpatient therapy, medication-assisted treatment. Many relapse, sometimes repeatedly. Addiction recovery statistics vary, but credible studies suggest that sustained recovery is possible, that with adequate support and often multiple treatment attempts, people can rebuild lives. But the support is often inadequate. Insurance coverage is limited, programs are expensive, waiting lists are long, and relapse is lethal in ways it was not before fentanyl. During treatment or incarceration, tolerance decreases. The body readjusts to functioning without opioids. When relapse occurs, and relapse is common in addiction recovery, users often return to their previous doses. But that dose, which was manageable when tolerance was high, is now lethal. They overdose and die, sometimes on their first use after a period of abstinence. The deaths accumulate. Families bury children, siblings, parents, partners. Coroners process bodies in quantities that overwhelm morgue capacity. Funeral homes develop package pricing for overdose deaths. Support groups for parents who have lost children to overdose meet in church basements across America, rooms full of grief that has no adequate outlet. In 2023, for the first time in years, overdose deaths decreased slightly from 107,941 in 2022 to approximately 105,000 in 2023. A 2% decline. This is presented as progress, and perhaps it is fractionally. Expanded naloxone access saved some lives. Increased treatment availability helped some people. Harm reduction programs prevented some deaths. But 105,000 deaths is not success. It is ongoing catastrophe. It is nearly 300 people dying every single day. It is babies born, withdrawing from opioids their mothers used during pregnancy. It is children entering foster care because their parents are too deep in addiction to provide care. It is emergency rooms, overwhelmed, treatment centers underfunded, entire communities traumatized. And the drugs continue to evolve. New synthetic opioids appear regularly. Nitazines, a class of benzimidazole opioids, have begun appearing in the drug supply. They are extraordinarily potent, in some cases more potent than fentanyl. They are difficult to detect with standard testing, and they respond poorly to naloxone, requiring higher doses or repeated administration to reverse overdose. The contamination of the drug supply is near total. Users seeking cocaine or methamphetamine encounter fentanyl mixed in, often without their knowledge. Counterfeit prescription pills are indistinguishable from legitimate ones without chemical testing. The only safe assumption is that any illicit drug may contain fentanyl in unknown and potentially lethal quantities. This is where 5,400 years of human relationship with opium has led. To powder synthesized in clandestine laboratories, to deaths occurring in bathroom stalls and parked cars, to families destroyed, to communities hollowed out, to a crisis so vast and persistent that 100,000 annual deaths is met with near resignation. The current moment is not a spike that will recede. It is not a temporary aberration. It is the culmination of every pattern established since Sumerians first cultivated poppies in Mesopotamian fields. The promise of relief, the reality of dependence, the commercial exploitation, the criminalization, the inadequate response, the continuing deaths. Right now, as these words are spoken, someone is injecting fentanyl. Someone is overdosing. Someone is being revived with naloxone, their third revival this month. Someone is entering treatment, hopeful. Someone is relapsing after 6 months clean. Someone is finding their child dead in the bedroom. Someone is manufacturing more fentanyl in a laboratory hidden in an industrial complex. Someone is smuggling precursor chemicals across an international border. Someone is prescribing opioids to a patient who will become dependent. Someone is lobbying against harm reduction funding. Someone is dying, their breathing slowing, then stopping, alone in the dark. And the machinery continues. Production, distribution, consumption, death. The cycle that cannot be broken by enforcement, by treatment, by awareness, by anything that has been tried. Because the fundamental conditions remain. Physical and emotional pain that demands relief. A molecule that provides that relief more effectively than any other known substance. And a neurobiology that transforms relief into dependence, into destruction. Every era believes it has finally understood the poppy, finally tamed it, finally perfected the extraction of benefit while eliminating harm. The Sumerians believed their priests could manage sacred medicine through ritual and restriction. The Greeks believed their physicians possessed the knowledge to dose appropriately, to heal without creating dependence. The British believed they could control opium through colonial monopoly and trade policy. The Germans at Bayer believed chemistry could improve upon nature, that acetylating morphine would capture analgesia while eliminating addiction. The Americans believed pain management could be revolutionized through pharmaceutical innovation and aggressive treatment protocols. Each generation approached the poppy with confidence, certain that previous failures resulted from insufficient understanding, inadequate technology, or moral weakness rather than from fundamental properties of the molecule itself. And each generation discovered the same truth. The poppy does not bend to human ambition. Opioid alkaloids interact with mammalian neurobiology in ways that are consistent, predictable, and ultimately devastating when exposure becomes chronic. The mu opioid receptors in the brainstem and throughout the central nervous system evolved to respond to endogenous opioid peptides, the body's own pain-relieving chemicals. When external opioids flood these receptors repeatedly, the system adapts. Endogenous production decreases. Receptor density changes. The threshold for normal functioning recalibrates around the presence of the external drug. This is not a design flaw. It is homeostasis, the body's attempt to maintain equilibrium in the face of chronic chemical disruption. But the result is dependence, a state where the absence of the external opioid creates system-wide dysfunction. Withdrawal is the body demanding restoration of the equilibrium it has adapted to, even though that equilibrium is pathological. No amount of marketing changes this. No legal framework prevents it. No cultural stigma eliminates it. The pharmacology remains constant across 5,000 years of human history. From Mesopotamian temples to German pharmaceutical laboratories to Mexican clandestine facilities, the molecule interacts with human neurobiology identically. Context shifts, technology advances, but chemistry is indifferent to context. The pattern repeats because the pattern is embedded in biology. Opioids relieve pain and create euphoria more effectively than any other class of drugs humans have discovered. This makes them medically invaluable and recreationally desirable. Chronic use creates dependence through mechanisms that cannot be circumvented by willpower or moral fortitude. And dependence creates a market that will be supplied regardless of legal status. because the demand is not preference but biological necessity. Prohibition does not eliminate this market. It transforms it. When opioids are legal and medically controlled, addiction spreads through prescription and pharmaceutical availability. The drugs are pure, the doses standardized, but dependence develops nonetheless. When opioids are prohibited, production moves to criminal enterprises. Purity becomes variable and often lethal. Contamination increases. Violence emerges around market control. But demand persists, supplied through whatever channels adapt to enforcement pressure. The historical record is unambiguous. The United States prohibited heroin in 1924. Heroin use did not cease. It expanded. Clandestine production replaced pharmaceutical manufacturing. The French Connection, the Golden Triangle, Mexican cartels, each supplying demand that prohibition created but could not eliminate. Enforcement became more aggressive over decades. Billions of dollars funded interdiction. Millions of people were incarcerated. The Drug Enforcement Administration grew into a massive federal agency with global reach, and heroin remained available in every American city. The purity varied. The price fluctuated. The specific trafficking routes changed, but supply adapted to every enforcement innovation. When one source was disrupted, another emerged. When one smuggling method became too risky, alternatives developed. The market functioned according to economics, not law. The same pattern repeated with prescription opioids. Aggressive prescribing created millions of dependent users. Prescription monitoring and restrictions disrupted pharmaceutical supply. Users transitioned to heroin, then to fentanyl. Enforcement targeted fentanyl trafficking. Production adapted to synthetic opioids that are easier to manufacture and transport. Nitazines, benzimidazole opioids, novel compounds that produce similar effects through slightly different chemical structures. The cycle is mechanical. Demand exists. Supply emerges to meet demand. Enforcement disrupts supply. Supply adapts. Demand continues. People die throughout, casualties of both the drugs themselves and the systems constructed to control them. This raises questions that most policymakers prefer not to confront. What if the war on drugs is unwinnable, not because of insufficient resources or incomplete commitment, but because it attempts to enforce prohibition against biological imperatives? What if criminalization creates more harm than the drugs themselves? What if the suffering could be reduced through approaches that acknowledge reality rather than attempting to legislate it away? These questions have answers, demonstrated in other countries that have implemented harm reduction as primary policy rather than peripheral accommodation. Portugal decriminalized possession of all drugs in 2001, treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal matter. Overdose deaths decreased. HIV transmission decreased. Addiction rates did not explode as critics predicted. Switzerland provides pharmaceutical-grade heroin to chronic users in supervised medical settings. Participants stabilize, reduce criminal activity, often eventually transition to abstinence-based recovery. These programs work, measured by any metric that values human life and suffering over ideological purity. But the United States has been slow to implement such approaches, hindered by political resistance, cultural stigma, and the entrenched interests of the criminal justice system. The machinery of prohibition employs hundreds of thousands of people: law enforcement agencies, prisons, courts, the industries that profit from drug war infrastructure. Changing course would require acknowledging that decades of policy created catastrophic harm, while failing to achieve stated objectives. Institutions rarely admit such failures willingly. And so, the current approach continues, a hybrid of inadequate treatment access, inconsistent harm reduction, ongoing criminalization, and enforcement that cannot seal borders or eliminate clandestine production. The result is visible in the death toll, 100,000 annually, a number that should trigger comprehensive emergency response, wholesale policy re-evaluation, mobilization of resources on the scale of pandemic response or natural disaster. Instead, there is resignation, awareness that the crisis exists, certainly. Incremental funding increases for treatment and prevention, but not the fundamental restructuring that would be required to actually reduce deaths to levels that other developed nations have achieved. The political will does not exist. The public attention has waned. Opioid deaths have become normalized, background noise, an acceptable cost of maintaining current approaches. The people dying are often poor, often marginalized, often struggling with mental illness or trauma or economic desperation. Society has demonstrated repeatedly that it will tolerate extraordinary death tolls among such populations before implementing meaningful change. The crack cocaine epidemic that devastated black urban communities in the 1980s and 90s generated militarized enforcement and mass incarceration, not treatment infrastructure. Only when opioid addiction spread to white suburban populations did the discourse shift toward viewing addiction as a disease requiring medical intervention. Even then, the response has been inadequate to the scale of the crisis. Treatment remains difficult to access. Medication-assisted treatment, the most effective intervention, faces continued stigma and regulatory barriers. Harm reduction programs operate in a legal gray area, often dependent on private funding and vulnerable to political opposition. The comprehensive approach that would actually save lives, combining widely available treatment, robust harm reduction, safe supply programs, and decriminalization, remains politically impossible in most jurisdictions. Meanwhile, the underlying conditions that create vulnerability to addiction remain unaddressed. Economic inequality has increased. Social isolation has intensified. Mental health care is inadequate and expensive. Chronic pain remains undertreated or inappropriately treated. The despair that makes opioids attractive, the sense that nothing else can make life bearable, persists in communities across America. This is the systemic failure that heroin's history reveals. Not simply the failure to control a drug, but the failure to address the conditions that make chemical escape necessary for millions of people. Opioids do not create suffering. They respond to suffering that already exists, offering relief that becomes its own trap. A society genuinely interested in reducing opioid deaths would need to address not just drug supply and treatment access, but the fundamental sources of pain and despair that make opioids so compelling. Such comprehensive intervention would require confronting poverty, inadequate healthcare, economic exploitation, social fragmentation, untreated trauma, systemic racism, and dozens of other interlocking failures. It would require investments measured in hundreds of billions of dollars sustained over decades. It would require acknowledging that individual pathology is inadequate explanation for a crisis that affects millions. That systemic causes demand systemic solutions. This acknowledgement appears unlikely. It is easier to focus on drug enforcement, to arrest traffickers and seize shipments, to present these actions as victories even as deaths continue unabated. It is easier to blame individuals for moral failing, to view addiction as choice rather than disease, to treat suffering as something deserved rather than something demanding compassionate response. And so the system perpetuates what it claims to prevent. Law enforcement budgets depend on ongoing drug crises. Pharmaceutical companies continue to profit from opioid sales, now including medications for addiction treatment. The treatment industry grows as addiction spreads. Prisons maintain capacity through drug offenses. Every institution has adapted to manage the crisis rather than resolve it, because resolution would require transformation that threatens existing power structures and profit streams. The quieter truth, the one rarely spoken in policy discussions, is that the system is not designed to end suffering. It is designed to manage suffering in ways that preserve existing hierarchies and economic arrangements. The deaths are not system failure. They are system function. The 800,000 dead represent acceptable losses in a framework that values property rights over human life, profit over health, punishment over care. Heroin's molecule does not care about these frameworks. Diacetylmorphine binds to mu opioid receptors according to chemical affinity, not social policy. The two acetyl groups allow it to cross the blood-brain barrier rapidly. Enzymes cleave those groups, converting it to morphine. The morphine binds to receptors, triggering the cascade of effects that have made opioids both blessing and curse for 5 millennia. This chemistry operates identically, whether the heroin is pharmaceutical-grade diacetylmorphine synthesized by Bayer in 1898, or illicitly manufactured fentanyl synthesized in a Mexican laboratory today. The neurobiology has not changed. Humans haven't evolved opioid-resistant brains in the century since Bayer marketed heroin as non-addictive. The fundamental interaction between molecule and receptor remains constant. What changes is context, legal status, purity, price, the sati, specific populations most affected, the rhetoric surrounding use and addiction, the policy responses. But the core dynamic, the relief offered, the dependence created, the suffering inflicted, that core remains unchanged across time and culture. Understanding this should generate humility, recognition that human cleverness cannot engineer away the fundamental properties of opioid pharmacology, that prohibition cannot eliminate demand rooted in neurobiology and suffering, that enforcement cannot seal borders against molecules that can be synthesized anywhere from widely available precursors, that the same patterns will repeat until approaches change fundamentally. But humility is in short supply. Each new synthetic opioid is treated as unprecedented crisis, requiring enhanced enforcement, despite decades of evidence that enforcement alone cannot resolve such crises. Each cluster of overdose deaths generates calls for tougher penalties, longer sentences, more aggressive prosecution, as though criminalization has not been tried exhaustively with catastrophic results. The alternative approaches exist. Evidence from other countries demonstrates that decriminalization combined with robust treatment and harm reduction reduces deaths, reduces disease transmission, reduces crime, often reduces overall addiction rates. This evidence has existed for decades. It is ignored or dismissed, not because it is flawed, but because it requires abandoning approaches that have become institutionalized, that employ hundreds of thousands, that generate billions in revenue for private industries. Change would require admitting that the war on drugs has been a comprehensive failure that created immense suffering while achieving none of its stated objectives. That mass incarceration destroyed communities without reducing drug availability. that billions spent on enforcement would have produced better outcomes if invested in treatment and harm reduction, that the moral framework treating addiction as criminal behavior rather than health condition has been catastrophic. Such admission appears politically impossible. Careers have been built on drug war rhetoric. Agencies depend on drug war funding. Private prisons need drug offenders to maintain profitability. Pharmaceutical companies benefit from both the crisis and its medicalized management. The system has too many stakeholders invested in continuation to permit fundamental change. And so, we arrive at the present moment. 100,000 dead annually, a number that represents slight improvement from recent peaks but remains utterly catastrophic by any historical or international standard. Fentanyl dominating the drug supply, making every use potentially lethal. New synthetic opioids emerging regularly, each more potent or more difficult to detect than predecessors. Treatment access inadequate. Harm reduction programs fighting for funding and legal permission to operate. Criminalization continuing to destroy, lives even as its failure becomes undeniable. The waiting continues for policy change that may never come, for treatment that remains inaccessible, for the next overdose, the next death, the next family shattered. The poppy keeps growing in Afghanistan despite Taliban reduction efforts, in Myanmar, in Mexico, wherever conditions allow. Legal pharmaceutical production continues, morphine and codeine for medicine, diverted product for black markets. Clandestine laboratories synthesize fentanyl and analogues from precursors that cannot be completely controlled without destroying legitimate chemical industries. The cycle persists because the underlying conditions persist. Pain exists, physical and psychic. Suffering demands relief. Opioids provide that relief more effectively than alternatives. Chronic use creates dependence. Dependence creates markets. Markets adapt to enforcement. People die. Families grieve. Society expresses concern. Policy remains largely unchanged. More people die. Right now, in this moment, the pattern continues its mechanical repetition. Someone is experiencing the first effects of their first opioid prescription, the warmth spreading through their body, the pain receding, unaware of where this path leads. Someone is recognizing with growing panic that they cannot stop taking the pills without becoming violently ill, that they have crossed a threshold they did not know existed. Someone is injecting heroin for the first time, terrified and ashamed, driven by withdrawal that has become unbearable. Someone is overdosing in a bathroom stall, their breathing slowing, consciousness fading, alone because stigma demands secrecy. Someone is administering naloxone, the third time this week, watching a person gasp back to consciousness, knowing they will likely use again within hours. Someone is entering treatment, genuinely hopeful this attempt will succeed where previous ones failed. Someone is relapsing after 6 months clean, the shame almost worse than the withdrawal they were trying to prevent. Someone is finding their child dead in the bedroom, the horror of that discovery, a wound that will never fully heal. Someone is in a clandestine laboratory, synthesizing another kilogram of fentanyl that will be cut into thousands of doses and distributed across networks that law enforcement cannot fully map. Someone is smuggling precursor chemicals across an international border, ordinary commerce indistinguishable from drug trafficking. Someone is prescribing a 90-day supply of OxyContin to a patient with chronic pain, aware of the risks but uncertain what alternative exists. Someone is lobbying Congress against harm reduction funding, arguing that enabling drug use is immoral, even as deaths climb. Someone is designing counterfeit pills that will kill people who believe they are taking pharmaceutical-grade medications. Someone is burying a loved one, the latest funeral in a community where such funerals have become common. Someone is alone in the dark, deciding whether tonight is the night they seek help or the night they give up entirely. And the poppy grows in fields that have cultivated it for millennia, in new regions where climate and economics make production viable. The flowers bloom white and pink and purple, beautiful and indifferent. The seed pods swell, the alkaloids concentrate, and humans harvest them, as they have since Sumerian farmers first recognized that scoring those pods produced something powerful. The chemistry has not changed in 5,400 years. Morphine, codeine, thebaine, the alkaloids that evolution designed as plant defense compounds, but which interact with mammalian neurobiology in ways that bring relief and ruin. We have isolated them, synthesized them, modified them, concentrated them. We have created delivery systems that bring them to the brain more rapidly than smoking or eating ever could. We have built industries around them, legal and illegal, medical and recreational. But we have not solved the fundamental problem. We have not found a way to capture the benefit without the cost. We have not developed opioids that relieve severe pain without creating dependence. We have not built social systems that address the suffering that makes opioid escape attractive. We have not implemented policies that reduce deaths rather than simply managing crisis. Perhaps we cannot. Perhaps the problem is insoluble, given the constraints of human neurobiology and social organization. Perhaps some level of opioid deaths is inevitable as long as pain exists and relief is sought. But the current death toll is not inevitable. Other developed nations have reduced overdose deaths to fractions of American rates through approaches the United States refuses to fully embrace. The choice exists. Evidence-based policy could be implemented. Treatment could be made universally accessible. Harm reduction could be robustly funded. Decriminalization could replace incarceration. Safe supply could eliminate the poisoned drug supply. The knowledge exists. The resources exist. What does not exist is the political will to confront entrenched interests and ideological commitments. And so, the waiting continues. For a crisis bad enough to force change, for leadership willing to implement evidence over ideology, for public demand that overcomes institutional inertia, for something, anything, to break the cycle that has repeated for 5,000 years with increasing lethality. The poppy waits as well, patient as chemistry, inevitable as gravity, growing wherever humans plant it or conditions permit, producing its alkaloids according to genetic programming, refined across millions of years of evolution, indifferent to human law, human suffering, human attempts to control what cannot be controlled through prohibition alone. Heroin remembers every promise humans have made, every claim that this time would be different, that this drug would be safer, that this policy would work, that this enforcement would succeed. It remembers Bayer's marketing of the non-addictive morphine substitute. It remembers Purdue's claims about OxyContin's safety. It remembers Nixon's declaration of war on drugs. It remembers every confident assertion that preceded catastrophic failure. And it'll be here in one form or another long after we are gone. Synthesized in laboratories we cannot find, smuggled across borders we cannot seal, used by people desperate for relief we cannot provide through other means, killing people whose deaths we accept because alternatives would require changing too much. The reckoning is this: we have learned nothing that changes the fundamental dynamic. 5,400 years of human history with opioids, and the pattern remains constant. Relief offered, dependence created, suffering inflicted. Society responding with inadequate measures driven by commercial interest and ideological rigidity rather than evidence and compassion. The waiting is this: we sit in the pause between the last death and the next, knowing both are coming, powerless or unwilling to prevent them, hoping that somehow, despite all evidence, this time will be different. It will not be. The poppy nods in the evening breeze and waits,